in the studio, we've got Labor spokesperson for Housing, Regional Development and Local Government, Keiran McAnulty. Welcome to the show, Keiran. It's a pleasure to speak
Thank
to
you, Blake. How's it going?
Doing fine. Hey, what do you start us off? What are your opinions on the government's announcement a few weeks ago that they were going to strip back the councils to nice to have?
Well, I think it's a load of rubbish. The fact of the matter is that this government has made some decisions that have tied one hand behind councils' backs. They scrapped the affordable water reform, which almost immediately meant that rates had to go up. And there was also a piece of work done by the Labor government called the Review into the Future of Local Government, which made some recommendations.
That was an amazing document.
It really was. And it was recognition of the fact that local government is no longer fit for purpose and there needs to be some changes. And at core to that is that the rating system is unsustainable and councils only have one option to do the things that are expected of them by their communities, and that's to put rates up. But the review was to look at alternatives so that the pressure wasn't on households. And this government scrapped it in its entirety. So councils only have one option, and that's to put rates up. And then after doing those two things and looking at withdrawing the funding or restricting the funding that government does give local government, they then have the gall to turn around and blame local councils for the situation that they're in. And I thought it was disingenuous and it was cynical.
One of the things that came through in that particular report as well, and it actually came up on this show last week when we were talking to Tori Whānau and Angela O'Leary from Wellington and Hamilton sittings, they're really concerned about some of the actions that happen within their councils, that there's no real accountability measures in place at the moment. And that was one of the things that came through in the report, was to set up like an independent ombudsman to run basically any kind of accountability issues that pop up across all councils and give you a uniform understanding of rules for councils to go into. Have you come across many issues with local councils who want something like that and kind of feel like they've been left out of the loop by the decision to dump this particular sort of suggested reform?
Yes, when I became Minister for Local Government, the review was not far from reporting back. And when it did report back, I said to LGNZ, Local Government New Zealand, they've got a real opportunity here to identify which of the recommendations they support. I wasn't interested in exploring another divisive reform. We'd just got our head around the changes that needed to be made in water reform and landed that in a place where we had the majority of support for councils. But it's fair to say that it was quite a rocky road up to that point. And I wasn't interested in going down that path again. So LGNZ went away and consulted with councils, and I've made them a promise that if they could come back and demonstrate broad support for those recommendations, or at least demonstrate which recommendations had broad support, then I would take it to Cabinet. Then there was an election and obviously a change of government. And so that report that they provided the new minister was completely dismissed. And I've been told that there were some recommendations that got as high as 85% support across councils, which is actually a phenomenal achievement and credit to LGNZ for the way they conducted things, because you've got all councils the size of Auckland right down to councils with only a handful of ratepayers. And they all have, whilst they might face the same challenges, they've all got their own perspective. They've all got their unique issues. And to get them all to give that level of support demonstrates a high level of working together and coordination, collaboration, etc. So that was a real chance. And so I do think there is a real appetite amongst the local government sector for some changes. I think it's fair to say that if we were asked today to design local government structure for New Zealand, we probably wouldn't come up with the one that we've got. And so we don't want a situation where government dictates to local government, but you want to make sure the system is set up so that it's easy for communities to make the decisions that are right for them.
Have you had much feedback actually from those communities around the Māori ward referendum? And I'm sure it's a heavily loaded question of what would Labour do when they get in at the next election around the Māori ward referendum?
Yeah, well, we strongly opposed what the government did. It is quite clearly, to any objective observer, an action that was motivated by race and race alone. The calls from the government, the pleas for local democracy and localism and all those sorts of things, utter hypocrisy when they then turned around and imposed their view on councils that had already made their mind up. And it's quite telling that only 2 of the councils that had put Māori wards in decided to scrap them as a result of this government decision. The rest of them have held firm and said, no, we made this decision because we've already consulted with our community and we believe that it's best for us to have Māori wards. And so that in itself is a clear showing that the government got this wrong. And even then, councils were put in an impossible situation because they had to weigh up the cost to their ratepayers of holding a referendum. And no doubt that would have played a part in those 2 councils that voted no, because in voting yes, they are basically voting to spend money on a referendum. So it wasn't a straightforward decision for them. But, as I say, the vast majority voted to keep them. It's a really important piece of information here is that all we did when we brought in this change was make the process for setting up a Māori ward exactly the same as any other ward, as it should be. Why should setting up a Māori ward be more difficult than other wards? There's no justification for that. But a crucial part of this is that it was not compulsory. If a local council decided they did not want a Māori ward, that was fine by us because that's their decision made after consulting their community. And so they've spelled it out that the government has made it look like this was forced on councils. It absolutely was not. Some councils chose not to have them. Some councils chose to have them, just like some councils choose to have rural wards and some councils don't. That's exactly how it should play out.
Before we move on to housing, I just want to say that one of the reasons we first were interested to get you on is you made one of our production tweets go viral a while ago by representing it in the House. So we want to say thank you for that, Mr.
Oh yeah, you read out one of my tweets from my local MP Dan.
Yes. Well, I just couldn't believe it, and I thought it was, summed up so well that the government's solution to the housing crisis, and they had no examples, and that's perfect. It's the one glimpse of honesty from this government we've seen. Quite clearly, it was a typo, but they couldn't have filled in the gaps even if they didn't make that typo, because everything they've done in housing is going to make things worse. They came in, let's not forget, they came in on an election promise that they would build more houses than the Labor government. And that is a massive promise to make when you consider that throughout the 6 years that we were in government, there was the highest number of state houses built, or social houses built, since the 1950s, about 14,000 and counting. There was record level of consents being issued, record build activity. For the first time in a long time, the number of first home buyers entering the market was increasing, and we had the highest number of apprentices trained in decades. And now, since the changes that we've made, the government's made, you've seen Kainga Ora stop building houses, the funding going to social housing providers scrapped to the point where they're only going to be funded for $750 a year from next year, when Kainga Ora alone built 5,000 last year. And they only paid for that by scrapping the first home grant, which helped around 10,000 at least 10,000 people a year into a home, into their first home, it's just going to go backwards. And I haven't even touched on emergency housing. They're sitting there crowing about the number of people in emergency housing dropping. Well, of course they have, because they're not letting people in. So it's so cynical. But the sad thing is that people are going to suffer as a result of these policies.
We've had a question come in from a viewer that I'll read out to you because it covers this topic as well. Mike wanted to know, do you feel that Bishop actually has an understanding of his role as housing minister?
Look, when Chris Bishop says that he wants to see houses being built, I do believe him. But he should be upfront with the country and say that he has a fundamental belief that it's not the state's job to build social houses, that he believes that the free market will deliver. And on that, we fundamentally disagree, because we've tried this before so many times in this country and it doesn't work. The 9 years of the key national government, the number of social houses in this country went backwards by 1,500. The free market does not deliver when it comes to social houses. And community housing providers, which is the government's provider of choice, will build houses if the government funds them. And because of the choices that this government has made, they don't have money to fund them. And so they've decided to give landlords a $2.9 billion tax cut, and which will see competition increase on existing houses rather than investment going into new houses. That was the settings that we had, and it was working. And they've stripped $1.5 billion out of the housing budget. So I do believe him that he wants to see houses being built, but it's a simple example of saying one thing and then bringing in policies that will do the exact opposite.
Some of that money for emergency housing was taken away and used to write that report, wasn't it? The Bill English report on.
There was money taken out of transitional housing, specifically for youth, which madness. But there was quite a telling moment at question time yesterday where they were crying about the fact that the numbers have reduced in emergency housing, and there were 2 points that I thought were quite telling. One, they said that the families have moved from emergency housing into social housing, which is great, but because this government has significantly reduced the funding going into new social houses, sooner or later there'll be nowhere for these people to go, because this government didn't pay for a single one of those houses. And second of all, one of the follow-up questions was, how much has the government saved by doing this? And I thought, there it is. There's the motivation. The motivation isn't to get people into homes. The motivation is to reduce the cost, the financial burden that emergency housing has on the government. You've got to look at it a different way. It's the cost of homelessness, because people wouldn't need emergency housing if there were enough homes. And the cost of homelessness goes far beyond the cost to the state on emergency housing. It's a massive contributor to poverty, to poor health outcomes, and to crime. And if you can address those through providing people a stable home, and it reduces poverty, and it reduces the demand on the health system, and it reduces the crime rate, isn't that a better way to save the government money? I would have thought so.
You'd think so. That just sounds logical. You can't use logic with this government.
No, you absolutely cannot.
And it's disturbing when we've got plots sitting empty that are perfectly usable.
Absolutely right. That would have been built on if the Labor Party was still in government. And a crucial stat that I don't think is well known, 70% of Kainga Ora residents have a disability. And Kainga Ora has been criticised by right-wing parties like the National Party, ACT, New Zealand First, for the cost of building houses. One, when you consider the number of houses that are built, I would strongly push back on that. When you consider that 70% of Kainga Ora tenants have a disability, and that quite often requires a particular type of house in order to be accessible, that's going to come at a cost. Now, will the free market deliver homes that are suitable for disabled people? They haven't in the past, and I don't believe they will in the future. So,
And as part of my advocacy, that's what I hear from my friends. Like, I'm lucky enough to have a wheelchair accessible house, but I've got so many friends that are struggling to find houses now that they have to do a bit of Kiwi ingenuity and build on houses that are not suitable for wheelchairs.
mm-hmm.
And it shouldn't be.
We know that. Sorry, Blake, I interrupted
It
you.
shouldn't be like that. That's all I was gonna say.
Yeah, it absolutely shouldn't be like that. Now, I do know that there's a strong call from the disability sector for 100% of social houses to be accessible houses. And I do believe that there needs to be a really high proportion of the houses that are accessible. The more dense you go with social houses, the more difficult it is to have 100% accessibility. Once you start to go above 2 or 3 levels, then it does create some issues. However, we are committed to ensuring that particularly units that are on ground level are able to be made available to those with a disability. It's not just wide door frames and ramps. It can sometimes go right down to fine details like making sure that door handles aren't circular, but rather a long handle so that people can grip it and turn it and those sorts of things. Things that perhaps the general public might not think about because they don't have to, and that's fair enough. But a government should think about it because ultimately we believe in the Labor Party that it's a core responsibility of government to ensure that its people are housed. This is a firm belief of our party since the 1930s. Last week was the anniversary of the first state home back in 1937. And it's been a proud but fraught process since then where we've had different governments placing different priority on housing people. Labor's gone up, National it's gone down, back and forth. And I just despair at that because so often you hear people saying, why can't you just work together? Well, on something so important like housing, if you can't get agreement on it, that makes it so hard.
And also, touching on disability as well, we've seen in recent days that some of the councils are not very happy that they're going to have to impose a higher parking fine for people that are not suitable for the parking in the park. They claim that it's too high. They claim that they're going to have disgruntled residents. But my argument is, and I don't know, I'm sure you agree that if they park in the wrong park, they should pay the fine.
Yeah, well, there's two things here. There's we've announced a policy that the government shouldn't require additional things of councils without financial recognition of the cost to councils. So every task you give a council, it means it costs them more, and ultimately that leads to higher rates. And for some councils, the smallest increase in cost can lead to a significant increase in rates. So there's a council down south that had to employ an additional cleaner because of an increase in tourists, and that equated to a 1% increase annually across their ratepayers and their rates. So it doesn't take much. And so that's one point. The second point is that I support the increase in fines for parking in disability parks. I think it is disgraceful behaviour that anyone that doesn't qualify would take the park of someone who has no alternative. Those disability parks are there for a reason. They are because they're usually next to accessible positions and accesses, etc. And I know that there's nothing more frustrating and hurtful when someone's trying to go about their lives and the limited number of parks available to them are taken up for someone that couldn't be bothered trying elsewhere. So I do support the increase in fines.
Yeah, I've had that many times myself where I can't get a part. One of those things. And if
And it can ruin your day, can't it, Blake? I mean, ultimately, it can scupper your plans for the whole day if you can't get where you need to get.
anything else from you, Paul?
Yeah, so I've got two more questions that have come in from viewers. One's probably going to be a longer answer than the other. Rose wants to know what the outcome and the next steps are for the meeting that you had last week about the toll road through your area.
Oh, very good question. We're all very hot under the collar about this in my patch, and on the Manawatu side as well. So, a very brief outline of the issue is that the Manawatu Gorge, State Highway 3, it was decided in 2017 that it couldn't be saved. The national government at the time fluffed about and tried to look at all sorts of cheap alternatives. Labor came in on a promise that it would build a new highway. That was funded, and that work has been underway ever since, and it's due to be completed in 9 months' time. This is not a new road, it is a replacement for a broken road. The National Party, the national government, have a $6 billion hole in their transport budget because they went round the country, they were dishonest, they promised everybody a new road and they were never going to be able to pay for it. And now the good people of Tararua, Manawatu, Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa are going to cop it because the National Party can't balance their books. $4.30 one way. And so many people live on our side of the gorge but work in Palmerston North that are now facing over $40 a week just to get to work or to get to the hospital or to get to school. And the median income in Tararua is $26,000 a year. That is a massive hit. And so we are opposing it very strongly. It's entirely on the government. It's their decision. They instructed NZTA to consult on this, and it will be a cabinet decision. So we had a fantastic public meeting in Woodville last Tuesday, and tonight there is a public meeting in Dannevirke. So Tangi Utakiri and I will be driving up from Parliament all the way to Dannevirke to attend this meeting, and then turning around and coming straight back because Parliament is on again tomorrow. But it's so important. We absolutely stand with the community on this one, and we'll be fighting it alongside them the whole way.
I see Tauranga has something similar happening to them at the moment as well. And new road that's already been paid for.
Tolls do have a role to play. If a community was offered a brand new road and they were told that, look, in order to get this across the line, we need to do this with a toll, otherwise it's not going to happen. That's a different conversation. This is about a road that is nearly done, that's already paid for. These people have already contributed to this through their taxes, and it's not a new road, it's a replacement road. Whatever way you look at it, it's not right.
Mm-hmm. And last question I've got here from Sally. She'd like to know how you manage to stay so calm when you're dealing with somebody like Simeon Brown, because she feels like throwing something at the TV whenever she sees him.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. But look, I've always sort of taken the view that getting wound up helps no one, and if I was to let this government and its ministers and their dishonesty, the disingenuous approach, and their snarkiness get to me, it wouldn't be the government ministers that make the headline. It would be opposition MP blows his lid. And so I like to think I'm a relatively calm bloke anyway. Sometimes that gets tested, but it's definitely best to just try and not let these things get to you and just keep the focus on the issues.
Perfect. That's all my questions. I'm done.
And I'm done as well. So we'll say thank you for joining us, Keiran.
Thank you, Blake. Cheers, Paul. Lovely talking to you, blokes.